All right, good morning, everybody. I think last week we sort of broke off we were in the middle of discussing obviously the Lord's Supper, but also talking about just the elements of how frequently we do it obviously as a remembrance versus other things, and just sort of in the context of also our own personal experiences over time. So I was going to just sort of circle back, and I'll throw up this slide for right now. Did anybody have any questions about sort of the four different views of the Lord's Supper that we talked about last week? Did that all make sense? Or let me rephrase that. As much sense as it can make sometimes.
Yeah.
All right. Yeah, like I said, either did something really right or didn't do it very well at all. So we'll move on from that. So we were finishing up with the understanding about what Paul wrote about the Lord's Supper to the Corinthians, and I think we were on really this slide when we finished up. And so we were talking a little bit about just the frequency with which we do it and other things like that. Did anybody have any additional comments on that before we sort of move on from this topic for now? We're going to come back to this topic, by the way. All right. Bringing us sort of back in context, we've been using this as our guide to sort of go through the various theological denominational positions. I don't have the version here where I'm coloring everything up. We've covered that lower branch with the Anabaptists. We've covered a good bit of not the latter part of it, but the first part of the Calvinist or the Reformed position. Of course, we covered the breakoff of the Anglican Church, but not as far as Methodism. And so today what I wanted to do was go a little bit down the path that we sort of abandoned because we started with Luther attacking the theses on the door in 1517, but then we sort of abandoned that and went in other directions. So what I wanted to go back today was to sort of finish up the life of Martin Luther and sort of get down to modern Lutherans, and then we'll connect Presbyterians and Anglicans and Methodists and Baptists and Congregationalists all as we pick up next week, sort of talking about a lot of what was happening with the church in general, particularly the church in England as the church is coming to North America, the colonization period. So when I throw Martin Luther's name up, what are some of the things that you think about with Luther again? Doing a little bit of a review here.
Devoted, brilliant.
Okay. What nationality was he?
German.
He was German. And so we talked before that Calvin was French, but spent most of his time in what we now think of today as being Switzerland, in the Swiss cantons, particularly Geneva. So Germany at this time is not a single unified state. That's not going to happen until the latter part of the 19th century under Bismarck. But Germany, for the most part, is a collection of principalities and smaller areas of rule, all normally under the guise of what we call the Holy Roman Empire. And so that's the backdrop or the setting for Luther and Wittenberg and what's going on inside of the Reformation there. So coming back over, I found this, which I think is we're going to look at a couple of different timelines today because they're helpful to sort of guide us through this. So this is that's Calvin. That's not even Luther at all. So why don't we go with this one? Here we go. So this is sort of a broad timeline of Luther's life. Born in 1483, and he sort of essentially a middle class family, what you might think of a merchant family. Certainly, Luther ends up going to school, goes to seminary, and then Luther ends up becoming. You might remember what Luther becomes. What is he? Not Luther.
What
becomes a monk.
Yeah.
And the story around Luther's conversion or his decision to become a monk is sort of this famous story of him being on an open road and being struck by lightning or having a lightning strike near him. And he basically says, God, if you don't strike me with lightning, I'll become a monk. That supposedly happened in 1505. Begins to study theology, and eventually he becomes a professor of theology at the university there in Wittenberg, which is where the theses are going to be tacked to the door. Of course, we've talked a lot about that date, which is 1517. When we first did this, that's been several months ago now, you may recall that it wasn't immediate that Luther was immediately declared a heretic and that he was excommunicated. There was a lot of this back and forth that happened, where there was debate that took place, and several sort of conferences or dialogues that took place. But ultimately we get to 1520 and 1521, which is the Diet of Worms. And so this is a meeting of all of the under Frederick, who's ends up being eventually becomes Luther's protector. But it's a meeting of all of the leaders in the area in the Holy Roman Empire. And one of the things that ends up being on the agenda there is essentially that Luther is being tried for his heresy he's been declared a heretic by the church, but it's up to the civil authorities to actually prosecute that or to carry that sentence forward. And so it's at the Diet of Worms that Luther is brought before, is asked to either recant, or he's going to be declared formally a heretic, and the penalty that goes with that. And what is the penalty that would go with that?
You mean excommunication?
Excommunication, and also and most likely execution. So of the two, neither one of them are good, but literally he can lose his life if he's declared a heretic. There's no protection for him. So does anybody remember what happens? Remember that they've negotiated both his transit there and his removal from there because of what happened to Jan Hus. So Luther cannot be immediately seized once he's declared a heretic. Does anybody remember what happens to him that allows him to get away?
His friends kind of kidnap him.
Yeah, he's quote unquote kidnapped by, we discover later that this is actually by folks that are working at Frederick's behest, and he's carried away into seclusion at a castle sort of high up in the mountains and secluded in Wartburg. And so that's what actually happens in 1521, and that's sort of where we left Luther. 1521, 1522 is that he's been declared a heretic, he's been spirited away under the guise of being kidnapped, although that was sort of an arranged thing. And now he's sort of living in exile under a different name. He's assumed a different name there in the castle in Wartburg. And so this is actually where he begins the work of translating the New Testament into German. And this is also about the time as we're getting the 1520s here, 1522 up through 1525, that a lot of the events that we were talking about are starting to happen in the other parts of the Reformation down in Switzerland. And so this is where we have some of the things that led us to seeing the break off here that eventually became the Anabaptist branch, where we're talking about the Anabaptists, meaning the rebaptizers, the ones who are now outspokenly saying that they're denying their infant baptism because they believe in believers' baptism. So all of this is happening in approximately the same time space that Luther is in seclusion, as we begin to have the other parts of the Reformation, Calvin, Zwingli, what's going on in the various parts of Switzerland. All of this is starting to come together. And of course, it's going to be a little bit later in 1534 that we eventually have what happens in England. So the Reformation is definitely well underway, and it's well underway in a couple of different ways. A very important thing happens in 1525, which is why I wanted to use this timeline. There ends up being a peasant revolt that's primarily in the German territories. And it's sort of sparked mostly by, or one of the things that the peasants are pointing to, are some of Luther's writings and Luther's teachings initially, which challenged the authority of the Pope and challenged the authority of the Catholic Church, but particularly papal authority. And so this revolt ends up being fairly violent. And this actually is a pretty important moment in sort of how Luther responds, in that Luther is very upset about the fact that this revolt is taking place and the violence that he's seeing. And so he begins to both teach and preach against the revolt.
John,
this-
are the peasants revolting against the papal authority, or are they revolting against Luther's teachings?
they're revolting against papal authority, and they're using Luther's teachings as justification for their revolt. So it's pretty violent. And by the way, it's not only a religious thing. There's social and economic things that are going on there, but it is a revolt against authority in general. And again, Luther feels somewhat responsible for it because they're using his teachings against papal authority and against the abuses of the church as justification for the revolt. And there's a lot of violence that's associated with the revolt. In fact, there's a lot of violence associated generally for this period of about 100 to 150 years with religion being at the center of violence. That's pretty much what the 100 Years' War is all about. And so Luther starts teaching and preaching against the revolt. He's very disturbed by the fact that his thoughts and his ideas have led to the situation where there's bloodshed and there's a lot of conflict.
Is it pretty much maintained in the German principalities, or is it spreading to other places?
It goes to other places, but it is primarily a German thing, or at least the way that most violent parts of it are. There is violence going on over in France because there's persecution there. Eventually will be known as the Huguenots, the Protestants that are there in France. So this is not just limited to Germany, but this particular revolt is very prevalent in Germany, and so that's why it's a particular interest to Luther. And so he writes in response to this and preaches in response to this, basically reaffirming the importance of civil authority, not necessarily papal authority, but civil authority. If you remember when we were looking at the timeline of the Anabaptists and some of the other things that were happening down in Switzerland, what was one of the characteristics, aside from the baptism question, what was one of the characteristics of what became the Mennonites, the Hutterites, and the Amish? What were they big about?
They're very nonviolent, aren't they?
They become very nonviolent, so that's a very important thing, Sherry. The other thing they're big about is the separation of church and state. Because remember, they're in Switzerland, there we think of, I'm gonna call it Switzerland, even though it's not Switzerland yet. In the Swiss cantons, there was a very high degree of authority that was being exercised by civil authorities on religious matters. Essentially, the town council and the church were very much the same thing. And so they were very much also opposed to having the civil authority tell them how they should interpret religious matters. And so this ends up being a point of distinction between some parts of the Reformation and Luther's sort of branch of the Reformation, is that Luther begins to teach and reinforce more strongly in response to the peasants' revolt, respect for civil authorities. Now he's again still not adhering to the absolute papal authority. Those are sort of broken apart, but very much picking up on some of Paul's writings there about subjecting ourselves to civil authorities. So this gets to be one of the things that's different about the Lutheran branch of the Reformation and some of the other branches of the Reformation is, what is the role of the state in the church? Any questions about that? I'm going to have a piece of sausage here because I just need a piece of sausage.
Sorry,
That's okay.
my timing for my breakfast was late, so that's why Don gets sausage.
Okay, so if there's no questions about that, I just want you to understand that there's that distinction that exists, and we're going to see that play through a little bit here. And it's also, in addition to the thing that we talked about last week, being differing points of view on what's happening in the Eucharist, the communion, the Lord's Supper, about what's happening with the idea of transubstantiation and consubstantiation, and the concept of it being just a memorial. That's one of the things that theologically divides elements of the Reformation here. But there's also additional things that are dividing elements of the Reformation over politics and civil authority. So part of the reason, as we talked about last week, why don't we end up with just one sort of counter church to the Catholic Church? Well, the reason is there were differences on some of these other matters where they couldn't all get together and they didn't share exactly the same point of view. Any questions about that? Comments about that?
So I know you've said that, like, if you asked Luther, he wouldn't have necessarily thought of himself as the start of the Reformation. But would he have still considered him Catholic at this point? I mean, not after he's excommunicated, but would he have still thought of himself as a Catholic, even though he didn't believe in the papal authority, even though he, what would he consider himself?
Everything I've read and seen suggests to me that at least probably at this point, he still would have liked to have seen the reform of the church and not having a break off into an entirely different entity. But that he's also realizing as time goes by that there's no way that that's going to be avoided or happen. And even if the Lutherans, and again, I'm using that term loosely because it really doesn't even exist. It would be those that adhered more to Luther's teachings. Even if the Lutherans had been able to reconcile with the church, there were still those that were down in the Swiss, some of the elements that were even starting to exist in England that were not going to do that. So by this time, it's sort of inevitable that there's not going to be a reconciliation and an agreement because they're far enough apart. First of all, there's a reason that they've split. They're far enough apart, but there's also a less likelihood and desire to bring things back together. By 1530, or during the period from 1530 until near his death, Luther actually does end up completing a translation into German of the Old Testament in addition to the New Testament. So eventually we do get a full Bible in German. That's actually an interesting, we could take a little side thing there that we could literally spend a whole class on in terms of how that came to be and how, because of what was going on in the humanist movement then, the rediscovery of Greek classics and a better understanding of Greek language and seeing the Old Testament in the original Greek. Luther actually, because of the way things work out, because of some of the work that's going on with Erasmus, actually probably ends up with better source material to do a translation than it existed at any point. And so his German translation is actually able to take advantage of some of what's going on in terms of the Renaissance and the rediscovery of Greek and even the rediscovery to some degree of ancient of biblical Hebrew, but particularly biblical Greek, to be able to produce a better translation. And so we actually do get the full translation that Luther completes before he dies into German. One of the interesting things when you hear the scholars talk about this, Luther's German wasn't that great. And so Luther as a translator into German is sort of an interesting thing. He was raised, but most of his training, of course, was in the seminary, that where he taught theology. And so Latin was the language of that he was actually probably more fluent in and probably used more frequently even than his native German. So another important thing that happened here, let me just flip over to this other timeline because I want to take advantage of several of these. So here's again, these are not aligned. I couldn't get them to space up in a line, but I wanted to include both of them for a couple of reasons. Is that on the left, you have another timeline of Luther's life, is that you have the Diet of Worms, the Edict of Worms, which declares him a heretic. He actually, we sort of forget that Luther is a musician and actually wrote songs. For example, does anybody know one of our probably most popular hymns that we attribute to Luther? He actually wrote "Mighty Fortress Is Our God."
Oh, yeah.
So a lot of the music that we have today, we can ascribe to him. So he writes the hymnal there that we see. Again, the completion of the German Bible. But what I want to focus a little bit on today is 1530. 1530 is also an important date because it's when the Augsburg Confession is completed. So anybody want to guess what it is, given that it has confession in the name? It's a statement of belief. We're going to see others that come along, the Westminster Confession. We're going to see others that we touch at various points here. But the Augsburg Confession is sort of important because it follows after what are called the small and large catechisms, which is the first time that Luther really tried to put down, and others working with Luther, because it certainly wasn't just Luther, the Melanchthon and some of the others. They try to put down in writing what their beliefs are. And this ultimately leads to the Augsburg Confession, which is actually putting down in writing what it was starting to become to be, quote unquote, Lutheran, as being distinct from being Catholic. And so I want to spend just a little bit of time today going through that, because that's an important moment. To Kathy's question earlier, was there a chance, that Luther still thought he could reform the Catholic Church? By the time you reach the point of the Augsburg Confession, it's very clear that they've decided they need to get down a documented understanding about what their beliefs are, because they're going to be functioning separately. I also wanted to show this timeline because the color show a little bit of the overlap. Luther is sort of here in blue, but there were the other things that were happening that were here in green. We've talked a little bit about them. Zwingli, the disputations, which these are the discussions that happen inside of the Swiss part of the church. And then you see the area in red here, which is during the period of time that Henry is ruling in England. So all of this is overlapping. We've done it separately, but all of this is overlapping at the same time. The other key date right there before 1530 is 1529. I mentioned this last week, the Marburg Colloquy. Just call these things simpler things. This was actually where there was an effort by Luther and Zwingli, who is going to die in just a couple of years later in 1531. He is the big mover inside of the Swiss area. They do try to come together and get to some, I mentioned this last week, common understanding, even a common understanding of what it meant inside of the Eucharist, and they're not able to agree. And so they're not able to agree on sort of a broader statement or of doctrine and belief. And so that's what leads to the Augsburg Confession being written just a year later, is we couldn't bring it all together. So now we're going to separately indicate what's there.
Don, what's the small and large catechisms?
Those are the first written summaries by Luther and others that were working with him on essentially what we will come to think of as being Lutheran belief. So just like the Catholic Church has the catechism there, these were the Lutheran catechisms. The small one was what you might think, it's a smaller, briefer document, and then that was expanded out into the larger document.
What exactly does catechism mean?
Not sure. It's
I
a
think it just means a grouping of beliefs.
yeah, I think that's a good way to describe it.
Or a teaching of beliefs?
Well, most often a catechism is written, and so
It says it's a summary of the principles of Christian religion in the form of questions and answers
yeah.
used for the instruction of Christians.
For those of you that are familiar with systematic theologies, which is what we use a lot of today, they're organized. And so these would have been a situation where a question was asked and then an answer was given, or there was a topical heading and then there was a response back to it.
Again, not growing up in the Catholic Church, catechism to me was a class you went to teach you certain things, but it wasn't necessarily written. I thought of it as something that you had to say to be part of the church.
The catechism class is that you study the written catechism. And of course, do Baptists have something similar?
Doctrine of faith.
We have the Baptist Faith and Message, which is a doctrinal summary, although it doesn't quite carry. Remember, the catechism also carries a level of sort of being at the level of canon law or church law to go with that. Okay, I've got several slides here, but we're not going to spend a lot of time on each one of them. But it's written in 1530 by I mentioned him a couple of times. Philip Melanchthon, who's Luther's colleague and friend. He was at the university with Luther and probably is the second most influential person besides Luther in that branch of the Reformation. He was certainly one of the ones who helped do a lot of the writing that Luther did and other things that are as well that went with that. So at this point in 1530, Luther is still an outlaw. And the purpose of the confession was to define Lutheranism in terms of orthodoxy, right belief, that only corrected abuses of the church. So this is also an effort to not just say this is what's wrong with Catholic practice, sort of the things that the theses even did. It wasn't just a statement of this is what's incorrect or needs to be corrected. This was a positive statement of what was the correct way to do things. Does that make sense in terms of the distinction? This wasn't just writing against, this was writing a positive statement. And it was ultimately signed by powerful German nobles who could protect them. And so this is one of the times, it happens multiple times throughout Luther's life, where he actually is protected by German princes and German nobles who are sympathetic to Protestant thought. And so by the authorities signing off on the confession, they're giving their agreement to the confession, and ultimately they're giving Luther protection. If you want to read it in some detail, you can still find it today. There's a reference, and this is where I pulled this slide from, bookofconcord.org. You'll see what the Book of Concord is here in a little bit as we go through this, but you can still find this document today. But it's actually putting down in writing the beliefs of the Lutheran Church, or what would become, at this point, not called the Lutheran Church. That's something that comes a little bit later. So just hitting the high points, they reaffirm the Trinity. They reaffirm the fact that man is born into sin and reaffirm who Jesus is. These are traditional Orthodox views of the Trinity. It's made very clear that we can't do anything to obtain God's grace or favor. This is bringing back in the concept of salvation by faith alone and salvation by grace. They do spend a little bit of time talking about how Christian life works, that God institutes the pastor's office for the purpose of delivering the word and sacraments, the role of the Holy Spirit, that we cannot choose to believe in Jesus. This is a little bit more along the lines of, while there was disagreement later between Lutherans and the followers of Calvin, Luther would hold to many of the broad ideas that Calvin did about the fact that God is the first actor in salvation, that God chooses to save us. We cannot choose God until God chooses us. And this is also a little bit of the move away from the ceremonial nature of the church. Ceremonies don't need to be the same everywhere, as long as the word, preaching, and the sacrament is done right. That's the core of what's there. In fact, very much the core then and the core now of a Lutheran service is around the preaching of the word, the sola scriptura, sort of represented by that, and then the delivery of the sacrament in the form of the Eucharist. And they still think of it as a sacrament. So that sacrament, there's among the 7 sacraments that are there, one of them is baptism. We've talked about this before. The belief here still is in pedio-baptism, the belief that the baptism that's delivered to an infant gives them an initial amount of grace that allows them to ultimately have the chance for salvation. And they also do believe, stated in the true body and blood of Jesus are truly present in the communion, that it was not simply a remembrance or memorial, but remember that Lutherans are not transubstantialists, they are consubstantialists. So it's that idea that it's in there somehow. Remember the sponge analogy that we looked at before?
Yeah.
That's where they fall. Forgiveness, they believe in confession. Repentance, this is taking a little bit of a turn away from what had been one of the initial things that Luther challenged, which was the idea of penance and that type of thing. And so our forgiveness is through Christ alone, and we can't do anything to earn that forgiveness. And then that the role of the church is to be the mechanism through which the sacraments and preaching is delivered. And that no one should preach or preside inside the church unless they're called to that. So this idea of clergy being called by God is something that they wanted to put clearly in in their tenets of what their faith was. And that the church rules are made by humans to keep order. They're not to be treated as God's law. Obviously, this is a challenge to the idea of papal authority. Church law is the idea that the God's law is superior to church law. It's another way of saying what? That scripture is superior to tradition. With respect to secular government, that rightful governments are instituted by God to keep order and justice. Remember what had so upset Luther in 1525 was the peasants' revolt. And so made it very clear that there was a role for government that was God ordained, and that we must obey secular authority unless that obedience causes sin. And so this is more in the area of a connection between church and state versus the separation between the two. With respect to faith and sin, there will be a universal judgment, and justification through faith alone. Again, this is an important part of all of what Luther taught from the beginning of the Reformation. There are some things that they wanted to make very clear that needed to be different. So in Articles 21 through 27, you don't pray to saints. Both the body and blood are given in communion. Clergy can be married. That was a distinction from the Catholic Church. That worship and communion are not sacrifices. That confession must occur before communion. That fasts are not required, but are good for personal piety. There were a number of required fasts in the Catholic Church. In fact, we're in one of the seasons now of one of those, the season of Lent, which is still a requirement. And of course, Luther was opposed to the monasteries because they were a separation from the community of the believers versus being part of that. So monastic vows are abolished.
What does it mean by worship and communion are not sacrifices?
There was a thought inside of Catholic theology that the very act of doing communion was a form of self-sacrifice towards earning the salvation that the church and the merits were giving
Okay.
them. Luther very much was the big tenets of a Lutheran service, the Lutheran liturgy, is to preach the word, which primarily is showing how we are guilty under the law, so that you can preach about grace, how we're made free from that, and then the provision of that through the sacrament. That very much is the form of a Lutheran service, pretty much all the way back until that day. And then the power of the church, there's a separation of secular and church authority, but there is certainly this, has already been reaffirmed, the importance of obedience to civil authority, and that bishops are to teach, preach, and administer sacraments and lead the church in good order. So there is still clergy and there's still leadership from the clergy, but it's not, again, the belief in papal authority the same way that existed before. This ultimately ends up later in 1581 being compiled into something known as the Book of Concord, which really is the doctrinal book that the Lutheran churches in Germany adopt. This is after Luther's death. And so this actually becomes the document, the Book of Concord becomes the document that Lutherans would look to for their theological norms. And it's incorporating all the things that we just looked at from the various parts of the articles that are part of the Augsburg Confession. So again, looking back at let's actually look back at the timeline. I don't know if I click on the right places. So this is happening in 1530. And in 1546 is when Luther's going to die. So this is put into place in the last 15 years of Luther's life. And as a result of that, and as a result of the German princes and the others who signed off on the confession backing that, is we actually have really the formal creation of sort of a separate church and separate church body that we eventually come to think of as being the Lutheran Church, beginning in 1530 and moving forward. I threw a lot of information at you there. So any questions? Sausage tastes and smells really good, by the way, guys. I need to point out something here. Late in his life, he wrote a book called On the Jews. And many of Luther's later writings are not friendly at all towards Jews. We talked about this before as we were going through the history. This is an ongoing thing that happens with the church in general. And it happens particularly here with Luther.
Is there a reason why?
Part of it was, I think, a lot of what was still the sentiment that existed throughout Europe in terms of that we looked at before, Jews being blamed for the death of Christ. They were in that unique position, remember, where they had risen to economic power because of the ability to charge interest and be money lenders. So part of it was economic as well. Luther was a man ahead of his time and or willing to break from his time in so many ways. And I think we recognize all the powerful things that he did there in terms of, the Reformation in general. But this is a stain on Luther and remains a stain on Luther moving forward. Some of the things that are written there are later became justifications for events that are not pleasant events. For example, some of the elements of the Holocaust. Folks would quote Luther to justify some of the things that were being done to Jews in 20th century Germany as being justification for that. So you will sometimes hear that. It's a fair criticism of Luther. But this was something that was, particularly looking at it from our perspective and understanding it better, is something that's, again, sort of a stain on for all the good that he brought and all the things that he did and how God used him. Some of the later part of his writings are very troubling in some ways, particularly on the topic of treatment of Jews and the role of Jews.
I think it seems like I've heard Bruce Gore talk about this a little bit, and he kind of defends Luther. He says that when you take everything in context, it's not as severe and as anti-Semitic as it's been made out to be in hindsight. I don't know. I haven't read much of Luther's writings themselves, but just thought I'd throw that out.
Yeah, I think that's a fair thing too. And again, part of the thing you struggle with this type of topic at any point is applying our perspective back into time.
Yeah.
It doesn't make it right, but if you see some of the things that were written about slavery 200 years ago, they're shocking and they offend us now, but they were more mainstream at the time. Doesn't make it right, but it does make it where it's difficult for us to distinguish the thinking of the day versus our modern thinking. And
I think about that too, just with what we've studied and just some of the things that to us seem impossible that happened, but if we were in that era, we don't know what we would have done or thought.
I've seen, I think I heard Gore make this case indirectly, and when he was doing his history thing, and we all know that I'm a fan of Bruce Gore, so I'd recommend that whole series, which is linked on our Sunday school webpage here, is I think it's also very, very, very clear to say that, whatever you want to say about Luther's position on Jews, there were plenty around in Luther's day that were far more harsh and that were far more antagonistic towards Jews than Lutherans were. But the writings are there. I mean, again, trying to figure out what the context is and how to apply that, I think is a challenge, but certainly he wrote the things that he did, and some of the things are pretty clear in terms of how they're written. So it becomes something of a stain it's actually used a lot, and has been used a lot in the last few decades, particularly as we were coming up on the 500-year anniversary of the Reformation, to sort of attack Luther because of some of the things that he wrote later in life. It certainly became a distraction from some of the things, particularly as we're looking back on it, from things that he wrote earlier in life and some of the things that were done as a result of the Reformation. Questions, comments? So let's carry this all the way down sort of quickly here, but in an effective way to talk about modern Lutherans. Because the Lutheran Church obviously still exists today. Is there a single Lutheran denomination today?
Yes, there is, but there are other Lutheran denominations also.
Yeah, I'm actually going, I really enjoy this website that I found and I've done some research on, Ready to Harvest. I used this guy's video before when we were covering the Anabaptists. He looks like he's 12. But he's actually a seminary professor inside of an independent Baptist. That's actually his theological background here. But I actually just wanted to play this video this morning that sort of covers at least the positions of 3 of the largest modern American Lutheran associations. I think he does an excellent job of summarizing that. And you can see some of the things that we've just talked about being brought forward, but you can also see how things have evolved over time. So let me see if I can make this work in real time. And actually cheated earlier and have it all set up here. So I need somebody just to confirm for me once this starts playing that you are able to hear the audio back through this. So if you'll just confirm that for me, I'd appreciate it.
Today, we are comparing 3 Lutheran denominations in the United States. They are the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, or ELCA, Lutheran Congregations in Mission for Christ, or LCMC, and the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod, or LCMS. As far as the size of these denominations, the ELCA is the largest in America, followed by the LCMS. The number 3 denomination is the Wisconsin Evangelical Lutheran Synod, or WELS, and the LCMC is number 4. I'm covering the first, second, and fourth largest denominations today, and not the WELS for the following reasons. The ELCA is the clear representative for mainline Lutheranism, not affirming inerrancy and often willing to buck the confessions. The LCMS is the largest confessional Lutheran body in the USA, and the LCMC is a moderate denomination with positions between those two. The WELS is slightly more conservative than the LCMS, so we'll discuss its differences at a later time. The ELCA was formed from 3 other Lutheran denominations merging together in 1988. The LCMC started in 2001 from churches leaving the ELCA, though today many LCMC-affiliated churches were never ELCA churches, and the LCMS originates in 1847, at the time a combination of mostly German Lutheran immigrant congregations. Before we get deep into the comparison of the ELCA, LCMC, and LCMS, let me make you aware that there are separate, more lengthy videos on this channel that clearly explain the position of each denomination on all of the issues that I am discussing here. If you want sources and a deeper discussion of the individual points that I'll be quickly comparing in this video, you'll find that information in those videos. On doctrines such as the Trinity, deity of Christ, virgin birth, and literal resurrection of Christ, the LCMC and LCMS affirm them completely, and congregations or ministers that did not affirm them would run the risk of expulsion. In the ELCA, though in most cases these doctrines are also affirmed, there are cases in all of these areas where some ELCA ministers deny these, and they are allowed to remain as ELCA ministers. As far as sacraments go, all 3 denominations are sacramental, not believing in only ordinances. The ELCA holds to baptism and communion, and most LCMC and LCMS churches would also only practice those 2. However, absolution is also an acceptable Lutheran sacrament, so some churches practice it. Although none of the 3 churches view immersion or pouring to be invalid modes of baptism, sprinkling is the common mode in each of them. All 3 churches baptize infants primarily, but unbaptized adult converts are also baptized. On confirmation, it is widely practiced in the ELCA, LCMC, and LCMS, with the ELCA particularly commonly using the terminology of affirmation of baptism. On the Lord's Supper, the elements are wine and bread. LCMS literature speaks negatively of using unfermented grape juice, while there are congregations that do so in the ELCA and LCMC, although wine is still most common. On whether the bread should be leavened or unleavened, the ELCA allows either, the LCMS position is to use unleavened, and the LCMC doesn't have a required position for churches. As for who can participate in communion, in the ELCA it is open communion, so even non-Lutherans who are non-Christians can participate in communion in many churches. In the LCMC, each church sets their own standard. Open communion is common here, though many would want the communicant to be a professed Christian and others would require them to be Lutheran. The LCMS restricts participation to members in other LCMS churches and to members in church bodies the LCMS is in altar fellowship with, such as the AALC. All three denominations believe in a 66-book biblical canon. The Apocrypha is not viewed as scripture, but the ELCA does have some apocryphal readings in its newest lectionary. On inerrancy, the ELCA does not hold to inerrancy, the LCMS does, and the LCMC mostly does too, though the actual word inerrant is not used, perhaps to avoid some of the assumptions that come along with using the term. On creation and evolution, most in the ELCA affirm human evolution as opposed to special creation. The LCMS officially holds to a literal 6-day creation and rejects human evolution, and the LCMC doesn't have any requirements, so likely a lot of the middle views between these two sides would be present. All three denominations affirm original sin, though in the ELCA, the meaning of that in many congregations may be interpreted in different ways. None of the three denominations teach salvation as being a one-time crisis or born-again experience, though there are some in the LCMC who teach that. The LCMS teaches against that viewpoint. In the LCMS and most churches in the other two denominations, baptism is viewed as a part of salvation, as a sacrament bringing salvation grace, but not absolutely required for salvation. None of the denominations are Calvinistic, holding to unconditional election or limited atonement. None teach the holiness doctrine of entire sanctification. Churches in the ELCA are not forbidden from being charismatic, but in practice, this has mostly died out in the denomination since the charismatic renewal of the 1970s. The LCMC has retained and gained some of these charismatic Lutheran churches, which are welcome, though most churches in the LCMC are not charismatic. The LCMS is mostly opposed to charismatism. In all three denominations, you'll find them to nearly all be amillennial. It's the stated position of the LCMS, and the other two don't require that view, but it still prevails. On homosexuality and gay marriage, the ELCA supports the LGBT movement and allows homosexuals to serve openly in the church and to be married in the church, though not every congregation is in favor. The LCMC and LCMS both proclaim homosexuality as sinful and oppose ordaining homosexual clergy or performing gay marriages. On divorce and remarriage, the ELCA as a denomination is permissive of both. The LCMS believes in certain acceptable cases for divorce and views remarriage as wrong after cases of unacceptable divorce. Churches in the LCMC will vary as there is no set position. The ELCA is split on abortion, with many being supportive but others opposed. The LCMS is opposed to abortion as a denomination, and the churches within the LCMC are also opposed to it, though the denomination has no official stance. In all three denominations, some congregations are more contemporary, others more traditional, and others with blended services or both types of service. None of the three denominations are opposed to the responsible consumption of alcohol. None of the denominations as a whole teach a required tithe. The LCMS is opposed to requiring a tithe, while some LCMC churches teach tithing. The ELCA has a modified Episcopal polity that does have congregational influence. Since their full communion agreement with the Episcopal Church, ELCA bishops are part of Anglican apostolic succession. The LCMC is strictly congregational, with very little on a denominational level at all, and the LCMS is also congregational, though the denomination makes statements and operates colleges and seminaries. The ELCA has bishops, pastors, and ordained deacons. The LCMC and LCMS have no bishops in the sense of a higher office, but simply pastors. Deacons are a lay office in the LCMS, often called elders. LCMC churches may ordain deacons or treat it as a lay office. In the ELCA, women may serve in any role, which is also the case in the LCMC, though individual churches may choose to restrict that. In the LCMS, only men may serve in pastoral office. None of the denominations require clergy to be celibate. Only the ELCA is part of the Lutheran World Federation, National Council of Churches, and World Council of Churches. The LCMC is not part of any other organizations, and the LCMS is part of the International Lutheran Council. These are of course not the only differences, but to learn more, you'll want to watch the videos on each denomination here on Ready to Harvest. The LCMS is compared to the Anglican Church in North America and the Presbyterian Church in America in another video here on the Ready to Harvest channel. Plus, we have many other videos on Lutheran denominations and history, along with other Christian denominations. Subscribe to Ready to Harvest and click the bell.
All right. He hit a lot of stuff there really quick, which is actually what
Say he speaks so fast. I can't listen that fast.
which is actually one of the things I enjoy about, because he packs a lot of information into a video. But what was your takeaway from just seeing that quick overview of at least three denominational components of Lutheranism?
So did I hear him correctly? The ELCA is the Anglican Presbyterian?
No, they have a relationship with the Episcopal Church where literally ordained clergy can move back and forth between the two. But no, the last thing he was talking about there was he has a video that similar to this one that looks at Lutherans, Presbyterians, and Episcopals in America, sort of in the same way.
It seemed
Hmm.
like the third one, the one to the far right, was
Yeah.
the most conservative.
Absolutely, and you can see where it had a lot of overlap, perhaps with what people may think of or identify as being Southern Baptist
Yeah.
points of view in terms of particularly on social issues.
And
Whereas you see-
what was the 4 letters for that one? Was
Oh,
it the AMLC?
It's the Missouri Synod,
it's the
whatever.
Missouri Senate, yeah,
The Missouri Synod was the one to the right.
Yeah.
correct.
That's the Lutheran church. I've never been in any other Lutheran church except a Missouri Synod church. So
Yeah,
But
and the ELCA you saw there formed in '88, and then that middle position was sort of in response to that. And by the way, I do recommend this Ready to Harvest site as being a really good place. He has a lot of really
Hmm.
good videos like that that are strong summaries, and I think he certainly in one video declares what his position is. He goes out of his way to have a video saying, just so you know where I'm coming from. I think he does an excellent job of trying to use source material to be balanced in what he presents. So it's interesting to me. The part of the reason I want to bring that up, particularly for the ELCA is by far the largest. You saw that in the graph that sort of showed the relative sizes of the three denominations. But what struck me about the fact is that, these are all under the heading of Lutheran, right? And yet when
Yeah.
you saw some of those positions, even on theological positions, you saw a pretty wide disparity about what's going on inside of that, right?
Yes.
So what do you make of that?
Say that again.
They all hold to be Lutheran, but yet you see a pretty wide distribution there, particularly on some of the theological questions about what's going on. What do you make of the fact that they're all Lutheran, but yet they can hold these different views?
People.
Good answer.
That's always the answer. People
Good
think different things.
Yeah.
And often, which I don't understand, what they think trumps what clearly seems to be laid out in Scripture.
to me, it's like the people have affected the church rather than the church affecting people.
I think that's probably true. And I
So
think it's. Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, I don't know if anybody has ever caught Matt Popovich on Christian radio, but he's a Lutheran. He's a pastor at a Lutheran church called St. Mark's Lutheran in Houston. And he's really good. And so I just happened to look up on his church website, and they are of the Missouri Synod. So that's probably why I like what I hear.
Yeah, probably so. Are there any other Lutheran sections around the world, or are these?
There's a number around the world. I just focused here on ones that are
Mhm.
prevalent in the United
America.
States. Yeah. And he mentioned the fact that, for example, there are multiple areas in the United States, but we happen to reside in one of them. There was a large influx of German immigrants
Yeah.
into the area that we think of as being Wisconsin and sort of up there in the Great Lakes region. And there was a very large contingent of German immigrants into Texas. There are a number of Lutheran churches all throughout Texas, and the reason for that is the large influx of German immigrants. And if you've certainly been to the Hill Country, think about some of the names of some of the towns up there.
Right.
They are, and think about why we have great places to get barbecue and sausage too, and kolaches. Yeah.
Yeah.
There is a very heavy German influence in Texas historically, which is why we have as many Lutheran churches as we do here, compared to other types of denominations that we don't find as many of. That aren't Baptist, for example, or that aren't Methodist.
Doug Weisskopf can tell you about the founding of the Republic of Texas, and we were one vote short of going German, speaking German in Texas.
There was a heavy influence. There is no doubt about that. You know, speaking of which, yesterday was the anniversary of the fall of the Alamo. For those of you that needed your Texas history shot today.
The German element in Texas also was very independent minded, very, very strong willed, very self-reliant and independent minded. And they were the biggest opposition to secession at the time of the war, the Civil War too.
Yeah.
Like Central Texas voted against secession.
Well, the Swedish Lutherans are the ones that started the Evangelical Covenant.
Mm-hmm.
Leave it up to the Swedes.
And there's a heavy Lutheran influence. I know this because of the company I work for and the people that I interact with. The other area of heavy Lutheran, I can go back to that. I have a map. Maps are handy. Remember some of the areas that were heavily influenced. It's purple on this map. But obviously the area that we think of as being parts of modern day Germany, the Holy Roman Empire at the time. But notice the other areas of heavy Lutheran influence are in Scandinavia.
Yeah.
So Norwegians, Swedes, Danes, Finns are of a Protestant tradition for the most part, and that is a Lutheran Protestant tradition. And you ain't seen nothing like taking time off for Easter until you deal with Norwegians on a day in, day out basis. They run from the Wednesday through the following Tuesday of that week with things that are going on.
Never let a Christian holiday go to waste. Huh?
They don't.
To morph another political quote.
So was there anything else about the exploration there, the video on the sort of modern American Lutheranism that jumped out at you to have questions about?
You said the liberal one, the East, I can't remember the acronyms, but the Evangelical Lutheran Conference is the largest one.
It's by far the largest one. I think it's at least as large as the next three combined.
Wow. Because I usually think of the Lutheran Synod or the Missouri Synod when I think of Lutherans. That's the one I think of.
Where we're at.
I think that has a great deal to do with where we are as well, Doug, as Kathy was just pointing out. There are a number of ELCA Lutheran churches, obviously, in Texas, but there's much more of the presence of the Missouri Synod here. And the Missouri Synod was by far probably the largest organization prior to the ELCA formation in '88.
And when was it formed?
The Missouri Synod was I think in 1847.
And the ELCA?
1988.
Oh, okay. So it's very new.
It's new.
Huh.
But again, they would also still hold to much of what we saw here in the Augsburg Confession. I mean, what you see there in the Book of Concord still continues to be what they would hold to from a doctrinal standpoint or doctrinal point of view.
I think Luther would be a little shocked that they are using his name.
There's a number of I've seen scholars talk about this, and I've read some things about this, that Luther didn't like the idea that even what he was sort of didn't like the idea that it was called Lutheranism, or that it, this was, or that it was Luther. He didn't like that at all.
What did he want his followers to call themselves?
I think he just wanted them to call themselves Christians.
Christians?
I mean, eventually, by the time of his death in 1546, he had certainly come to realize that there was not going to be a connection back to, there was not going to be one church again.
Right.
That the die had been cast. And the other thing that happened, we covered this a little bit. We'll cover it again more later as we talk about the Counter Reformation, because we have to sort of cover that once we get through the main branches here. But Council of Trent, the Catholic Church does not just sit idly by while this is going on. They begin to actively push back, and there are some reforms that are brought in, but they actively push back. And the Council of Trent, in the middle of the 16th century, about the time of Luther's death, is when that's going on. It runs for about a decade. Is an active pushback against the things that are there, but also reaffirming some things that are there. So they were going to stay very separate. But I don't think Luther was ever comfortable with the idea that he had founded a branch of Christianity that bore his name. That was very unlike who he wanted to be and what it was all about. We talked about this before. In some ways, I really have come to view Luther more and more as sort of a reluctant leader. He wanted to raise some questions and have some reformation, but he didn't want to create a revolution. Got caught up in things. Questions, comments?
Couldn't we equate a lot of the Reformation changes have also occurred in the Catholic Church? And also I see a lot of similarities with the Protestants and the Catholic Church. But I think the Catholic Church was reworked quite a bit, being able to preach in your native tongue to the congregation. And there's a whole bunch of things that I think that Luther's Reformation brought to the Catholic Church.
I think that's a true statement, Mickey, in the sense of even in reaffirming things that they were reaffirming that were in contrast to Luther, the Reformation the fact that there was a counter Reformation was the result of the fact that there was a Reformation to begin with. Mm-hmm. And in that counter Reformation process, there were some things that were changed. For example, the indulgences and other things like that. Essentially, right. Some of the very first things that Luther was challenging were corrected fairly quickly. It's just that he had something was. And by the way, we talked about this before. It's not like there hadn't been any Reformation thought before 1517. There had been Huss, and there had been Wycliffe, and there had been others. So it wasn't like that just sprang out of nowhere. So Luther sort of ignited and poured fuel on some things that also existed otherwise. Okay. So this is the plan moving forward, if I can navigate us through it. So we've now sort of covered all three of these lower branches to a degree. We'll come back and pick up on sort of the same thing with modern Presbyterians. But picking up next week, what I really want to pick up on is this important break that sort of happens here that eventually leads to around 1607, which is the break off of Congregationalism, and what ultimately leads to this path here, which leads to who our identity is in terms of being Baptists, but also then looping back over very quickly to show the similar things that happen with Methodism inside of the Anglican Church. I probably will end up showing another video from Ready to Harvest. I was looking at it yesterday. There's a lot of stuff going on right now inside of the organization of the Methodist Church. And so actually a recent video that he's done within the last couple of weeks covers what's going on there in terms of United Methodists here in North America. And so we'll pick up on that as well, carrying things forward, but also understanding how Methodism eventually leads to this is all part of sort of the holiness movement or holiness churches, how that eventually leads to the types of things that we know as being like you see here, the church, the Nazarene Church, other things like that, but also the break off to Pentecostals. So we will come here next, sort of where we'll come into this out there. We'll come into this area right here, which will be more near and dear to us because we'll understand how we came to have the importance of congregationalism, but also how that breaks off into Baptist thought. Okay, questions, comments?
I will say this, the Evangelical Covenant Church does not have a major presence in Texas. It's more of a northern denomination up around Illinois.
Yep.
There is one church in Houston that has made it. I don't know if the one in Dallas is still around, but there is an Evangelical Covenant Church in Houston. It's the Hope Community Evangelical Covenant Church. We were a part of the Deerbrook Evangelical Covenant Church that folded. So.
And I'm looking now, I think this is true because I talked to her about it. My coworker, who I mentioned before, who is Lutheran, I believe the church there in Alvin affiliates along those lines as well.
Evangelical Covenant or what?
That's what I'm looking up now. I'm trying to remember.
Well, Evangelical Covenant is not part of the Lutheran Church. They are their own denomination.
Yeah, I'm thinking about ELCA. I'm sorry.
And Jeff was at one point the equivalent in the church. They didn't have deacons. They had elders that were in Illinois, but Jeff was, they called him the council. He was on the council in that church. So equivalent to they weren't ordained though, but the closest to in their church, Jeff was a part on the council at the Evangelical Covenant Church in Deerbrook.
Sherry, is that what he grew up as, was Lutheran?
No. We started going to that. He grew up Baptist.
That's what I
We
thought.
started going to that church when we got married. All three of my children were dedicated in the Evangelical Covenant Church. We did not start attending a Baptist church until Sarah was in 5th grade, I think. We were, my children grew up in the Evangelical Covenant Church until Sarah was in 5th grade.
So if you don't mind sharing from that experience, what biggest similarities or biggest differences having been in both Baptists in there? I think the obvious ones are the obvious ones. I guess I'm looking for something I may not be thinking about.
Well, one of the things that, they're kind of like, you do your own thing, which is bothersome in some ways, but freeing in others. They had basic tenets. They believed in the Word of God. They believed Jesus Christ was the Son of God. They believed that the only way through, salvation was believing in Him. Like when Christ said, "I am the way, the truth, and the life," that's what they believed. But what they didn't focus on was like whether you had infant baptism or, believer's baptism. That was left up to the individual person. So Jeff and I, coming from the Baptist background, of course, we didn't believe in infant baptism. That's why we chose to have our children dedicated and not baptized. So there were children that were dedicated and children that were baptized. But on top of all of that, they had a confirmation class. Of course, my kids didn't get that far, but they had a confirmation class once you became a believer that you could attend. And that was whether if you were an infant baptist, if you were baptized as an infant, they had it at a certain age. I don't know what the age was, but even if you were a believer's baptism, you still went through a confirmation, which, that's okay. So, whether you served wine or grape juice was not an issue. Whether you had, passed an offering plate or had a box in the back. It wasn't a big deal. It was like their deal was, they said they focused on the main, what should draw us together as Christians, not what would divide us as Christians. So
I'm reading, I looked it up, Sherry, and one of the tenets is the belief in freedom in Christ.
yes.
And it says, we believe in the reality of freedom in Christ. This freedom creates a climate which allows for differences of opinion in matters of interpretation, doctrine, and practice within the context of biblical guidelines and historical Christianity.
And one of the things that Jeff and I disagreed with is they didn't have a problem with women being pastors. And they asked me at one time to be, like I said, they didn't have deacons, they had elders. The elders were in Chicago. This was not a congregational church. The elders were in Chicago. So the church, each church had what they called a council. And they asked me to be on, it wasn't an ordained position, but they asked me to be on the council too. And I respectfully declined. And that caused some big discussions with the pastor at the time about why and blah, blah, blah. So anyway, I ended up not being on the council because I declined, but it didn't, I mean, it was okay. You know what I'm saying? It's like, that's what you believe. So it's okay. You don't, so. Anyway, that's what drew us to it was, the freedom and cry. And it wasn't, Jeff had some really bad experiences in the Baptist church and when growing up. So this is where we ended up. We served in this church. We were founding members of the Deerbrook Evangelical Covenant Church. We were on their charter. But the church didn't make it because of the leadership in Illinois. And so anyway.
I just pulled this up. This obviously doesn't represent every location, but to Sherry's point, these are some of the major.
But see, this says Evangelical Lutheran. That's not Evangelical Covenant.
Yeah, but I'm talking about for the ELCA that we were talking about earlier.
So the Evangelical Covenant Church that you were a member of was not affiliated with Lutherans at all?
No.
It's its own denomination.
It's its own denomination. And there is one church in Houston still. When they came, we were a missionary church, and there were 3 missionary churches started. Ours was Deerbrook Evangelical Covenant. There was Hope Community Evangelical Covenant, and I can't remember what the third one was. But the third one folded pretty quick. Deerbrook lasted, 10, 11, 12 years. I'm not sure how long they stayed around after Jeff and I left. We were members a good 10, 11 years, but Hope Community is still there. And they're in the Klein area.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Their website shows like 7 churches, all on the west side.
Yeah, we're you can see here by the map I'm showing now, we're definitely not in a highly Lutheran part of Houston.
There's a Covenant Baptist Church, Covenant Glen United Methodist. It's all kinds of covenant.
All right.
But yeah, they were big on making sure that we knew we weren't part of the Lutheran church. There was a break off the Swedish Lutheran church. And they have a big seminary. It's called North Park Theological Seminary in Chicago.
So they did break off from the Lutheran church?
Yes.
What was their main element of what caused the break?
I don't really remember that. I mean, there was none of the ritualistic type stuff that you would see in the Lutheran church. Now I don't know if that happened. I mean, because evangelicals, they were like 1850, something like that.
Right.
I mean, it may have been originally, when it first broke off, but there was none of the liturgy or anything that you would see in a Lutheran church nowadays, and at least the Missouri Synod Church anyway.
Hmm.
But it was a very interesting. I had never coming from Baptist, I'd heard of Methodist and Presbyterian, but I had never heard of an evangelical covenant church. So it was new to me. And I don't know the difference. And they also made a big deal of that being evangelical free. And I do not know the difference between, I do not know what the evangelical free teach. So, but I know.
I'll make a point next week of when we start out to look at those particularly things that were happening in the middle of the 19th century for those two terms.
What was the term again? Evangelical?
Covenant.
Evangelical covenant started like in the 1850s.
Right.
But the evangelical free was like in the 1950s or something like that.
Correct. You saw that on the getting back in where I can show it again, but you saw it on the PowerPoint as it was carrying things forward. Let me see if I can pull it up, get there quickly since I closed it. 1885. 1885 for the evangelical covenant, 1950 for the evangelical free.
Yeah, but I don't want to say that the evangelical covenant was as liberal as that far left, the ELCA. I don't.
Yeah,
ECLA.
the ELCA is definitely on the liberal end of the Lutheran spectrum, definitely.
So I mean, I don't think the evangelical covenant church went that far. You know what I'm saying? They did not go that far.
What I'm reading, it says Swedish immigrants breaking off from the Lutheran, which was the state church of Sweden, began the Swedish Evangelical Mission Covenant of America on February 20th, 1885 in Chicago, Illinois.
Right. As I mentioned before, when we were looking at the map, really done. Now I can't get it to come up now. So, oh, here it is. Too many windows. But again, that very heavy, this is all Lutheran in Northern Europe. The area we think of as Germany today, sliding over towards Poland. Prussia obviously being, a German influenced area, but this whole area up here, it is very much the Lutheran church to the extent that any of these Scandinavian nations still have a state church. It is going to be a Lutheran state church in terms of its theological bend. That is carried down to today. And in fact, all the flags of the Scandinavian countries, the modern flags, they all have the cross on them. Just they're different. They look exactly the same, except they're all different color schemes. That's because of this commonality that exists with recognizing themselves as Christian, but particularly recognizing themselves as being Lutheran. All right. I'm going to go ahead and stop our recording. I can find the magical place, and there it is.